Hello everybody. So complementing a little bit the little video from John Green that you already saw in a previous activity. Now we're going to review some of the most important events that happened in the interwar period. The interwar period, or in Spanish, periodo interguerras, is the name we refer to exactly to this period that happened between the Great War and the Second World War and lasted during the decade of the 1920s and the 1930s. Well, many things happened during these times. Most of them were consequence of Great War, and many of them eventually led also to the emergence of fascism in Europe and a lot of conditions that later on led to the beginning of the Second World War. So we can say that these topics are important because basically they help us join what happened in the Great War towards what would happen in the Second World War. Okay, so ironically speaking, the first of our topics regarding the interwar period is the Spanish flu. Originally, I was planning to do a more a broader topic about this issue. However, since nowadays it's something quite sensible, I'm speaking about it in a really fast way. Okay, so after Europe was devastated with the Great War, it was hit by a second catastrophe that was the Spanish flu. The Spanish flu was a large-scale flu, a large-scale pandemic like the one that we're living in right now, that had as casualties up to 20 to 100 million deaths. However, this number is quite difficult to research because of certain issues. Generally speaking, I bet you've been following the news, etc. And of course, maybe you already came across an article about the Spanish flu. Okay, the issue is that we cannot research a lot about it because basically, well, as soon as it came, as easy as it came, as easy as it disappeared. It lasted around 2 years, and after those 2 years, most people stopped having the symptoms, presenting the sicknesses, so the medical community assumed that we had already adapted, that we as human beings had already adapted to this kind of flu. As a matter of fact, a lot of scientists believe that the influenza that occurred in 2009 was not as devastating as this one, although as you can see it was the same species of virus, because in 100 years we had already developed immunity to this kind of flu. However, when it appeared, it became way more devastating than the situation that we're living right now. The second issue why it's so difficult to understand this issue or to historically refer to this issue is because basically it happened just after the Great War began. After the Great War ended. So we can say that the Great War lasted from 1914 till 1918, and from 1918 to 1920, Europe and the United States and most of the world continued facing problems, but now in order to find a pandemic. And well, since they came just recovering from war, well, of course, there were a lot of deceased people, a lot of less people. Hospitals were attending the people from the war, so they didn't have the conditions to attend this emergency, and that's why it became so lethal. Again, taking into consideration the situation that we are living right now, I know that this is a sensitive topic, and well, however, I also want you to have another perspective, so you can see that the contemporary situation of coronavirus apparently is nothing with the impact the Spanish flu had. The reason why we cannot know exactly the million of people who died in this infection was mainly because since it came so close after not only the Great War, but also some other large-scale wars, such as the Russian or the Mexican Revolution, then we cannot identify very good which people died because of long-term consequence of the Great War, how many people died because of the Spanish flu, and also, well, most research nowadays consider that the Spanish flu got originated not in Spain, but in the United States, and that it basically spread through Europe through the American troops that went to help in the Great War. To give you an example, the first place in Europe where the Spanish flu was registered was in the port of Brest in France, that was coincidentally, the main port where Americans would arrive to Europe in order to fight the Great War. So it's also kind of interesting because although the Americans arrived to help the Europe, maybe they also carried this super deadly infection. Okay? So I don't want you to get nervous, I just want you to have another perspective and see that, well, as we've already studied it, this kind of flus, this kind of pandemics have always existed in our lives as human beings, and they will be constantly a factor of change. Okay, so, well, we leave behind the Spanish flu. So remember that during the 19th century, who was the world power, the main world power? The Queen of the Seas, Britannia. However, after the impact of Great War, remember they were deeply in 4 years of constant conflict against Germany, the whole against Germany, against the Turkish Empire, against Austria, etc. Britannia was quite weakened because of the Great War, and after it was hit by the Spanish flu. So after the decade of the 1910s began, we can say that Britannia as a world power ended up sinking. So after that, Britannia sunk, and it would never rule back the waves. As well as Britannia, although Great Britain remained with its monarchy, it lost a lot of symbolical power. And because of that, many other liberal democracies that wanted to follow the model of Britain also lost strength, and many of them became republics. So a lot of the monarchies in Europe, in Asia, that still survived by the beginning of the 20th century, after the Great War, they collapsed and they changed into republican democracies. Okay, so since Britannia sunk, remember, which was in the 19th century the world power that was just behind the United States, and just behind Great Britain, and each time acquiring more power in the American continent. Well, the United States. Having Great Britain, France, Germany, etc. out of their way, USA became the main world power. And this opened a time known in American history as the Roaring Twenties, that can be considered the most glorious time of contemporary American history. Since most of the world's economies collapsed because of the Great War and the Spanish flu, then the United States was able to supply all those international markets that were destroyed by these two catastrophes. So in that way, the United States started observing a bloom that was never experienced before in the history of this country. So suddenly, a lot of enterprises started emerging. There was a lot of positive way of thinking regarding the American economy. Why? Because they didn't have a considerable competition. They were the main world power of the world. They were not the only standing world power at that time. Remember, I already told you that some countries that were left quite immune after the Great War and that actually became the world powers of the 20s and the 30s were Japan and, believe it or not, Argentina. Argentina was at this time believed to be the United States of the South, and as well as many people from Europe started migrating to the United States, they also migrated to Argentina. They said, well, yes, Argentina has a lot of space. Argentina's territory is quite larger, is like 3 times larger than Mexican territory, with 1/3 of the population, and it has a lot of mining, it has a lot of minerals, it has large fields where you can cultivate wine, beef, wheat, etc. And in addition, it has access to the Atlantic Ocean, it has a strong navy, so a lot of people started admiring Argentina at that time. We can say that Argentina became one of the few remaining world powers. However, it was way behind the United States. The United States was leading all the world and its economy. So a lot of enterprises started blooming in the United States. This is the time when New York City literally bloomed, when it started having millions and millions and millions of people. It started becoming way more important than Paris, London. It became the leader of the world. Many enterprises were founded of automobiles, textile factories, production of goods, electrodomestics, etc. All of these things produced in the United States. And in addition, well, investment in mid and long term grew impressively in this time, mainly because, well, the United States knew that basically Europe was partially destroyed, and it was depending on the American economy and the American markets to recover. So suddenly, all the businessmen and entrepreneurs in the United States knew it was a good time for investment, and they started investing a lot of money, mainly in the recuperation of Europe. So in that way, American companies started recovering the European markets. However, Europe never recovered back again its power over the world. Since 1920 up to this date, Europe is nothing against the United States. Okay? In addition, these large-scale investments also led to a lot of speculation. We already saw this term when we were studying the Dutch Empire. Remember that speculation is when you start investing in buying stocks primarily of companies that you see are growing in a fast rate, or you can also buy goods that are growing in a fast rate, that are incrementing their value in a fast rate, expecting that you will eventually have more money. So for example, if you bought an apartment at Florida at, I don't know, $250,000, then you could buy an apartment there, expecting it to increase its price, because basically all American economy was blooming. Everybody was producing more in order to replace the European markets, and since everybody was producing more, well, they were selling more things. Selling more things meant having to hire more workers being hired meant more people buying stuff means more production means more workers, and you already know this cycle. So basically the United States was blooming. This is also the time when Hollywood bloomed, when Universal Studios got founded and it started operating. Warner Bros., the Walt Disney Company, for example, the first time Mickey Mouse appeared in a cartoon was in 1927 short animated film, Steamboat Willie. Also we have, for example, Felix the Cat, we have Betty Boop, etc. A lot of these ideas of entertainment, of American entertainment, the little dolls dancing like this and blah, 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 with the big eyes, etc., all came from this time. The United States was super trusting in their economy. They said, our economy is the strongest one, is the one that is blooming the most, we are producing the most, we are leading the world for the first time in our world history. Again, we can say this time the Roaring Twenties basically inaugurate the predominance of the United States as the main and only world power in the world. So of course the people in the United States were basically roaring like Katy Perry. Their economy was roaring, was blooming, it was super strong, and everybody was feeling a lot of trust in American economy. However, remember that all fairy tale has an ending, and this fairy tale of the Roaring Twenties finished with an event that eclipsed everything that was achieved in the 1920s. Was eclipsed in the 1930s because of the Great Depression. Okay, so basically what happened? So many Americans started investing a lot of money without control in absolutely everything. And not only Americans, but also banks would start investing in large-scale projects, expecting the American economy to continue blooming, growing, roaring, etc. However, eventually, that roaring and blooming of the American economy reached the top. And well, the thing when these things reach a top is that investment cannot still go up. So suddenly all the values of all the prices, all the values of goods, etc., since they could go higher any longer, well, they started going down. And so what happened when the prices started going down? Well, the people suddenly started to feeling an urge to start selling everything they had, all their stocks, all their goods, etc., in order because they were noticing that everything that they were investing, expecting to have a greater value, suddenly started losing their value, losing their value, losing their value, losing their value. We already studied the situation the Netherlands also faced, called it tulip mania. Well, basically, the Great Depression began as a great tulip mania. Suddenly, people realized that all the things that they were investing in order to expect them to have a higher value, they were not having the value that they were expecting to have. So suddenly, they started selling everything, and of course, the prices started collapsing, and that meant that people started losing a lot of money. That eventually led us to the 1929 stock market crash, when basically all the stocks that were located in the New York Wall Street stock market suddenly crashed in an event called as Black Thursday in 1999. That crash led to a lot of US bank failures. So suddenly, banks realized that they didn't have the money to pay back their customers, so their customers started taking away all the money they could from the banks. And since the banks had no money anymore, they started falling into bankruptcy. So the issue is that banks, in order to put your money to work, and remember that, well, I'm a historian, I just took a very few courses of economy, so if you're more interested in this, well, ask somebody that knows a little more about economy. I'm just telling you the basic things. So basically the thing is that these banks that had a lot of money invested in other enterprises and that also had bought a lot of credits, well, suddenly, since all people were taking their money away, they fell in bankruptcy. Since they fell in bankruptcy, all the people who were expecting to have the payments of the banks, because the banks had bought credits from them, suddenly they didn't have the credits. And since they didn't have the credits, then they couldn't also pay their own debts. So everything became like a domino chain where everything suddenly was collapsing. So the people were afraid, they took their monies from the banks, their banks went from bankruptcy, then the banks didn't have money to pay their own debts, and so the people who had shared money with the bank, suddenly they didn't have either money to pay their debts, so suddenly everybody was doing to everyone. Basically, an economic crisis is when you realize that you don't have the money that you were expecting to have, however, you had already spent it based on the money you were expecting to have and not based on the money that you actually have. So when companies realize this, all the investment stock, and they realized that they couldn't go on. Why they couldn't go on? Because in order to produce more, they needed to get more money. However, they didn't have more money because they were owing money either to the bank or to the stockholders, etc. So they said, okay, let's reduce production. However, what happens when you reduce production? So when you reduce production, you need less people working. So a lot of companies started firing workers. Now, if you fire workers, then the unemployment rates rise because you have less people working. If you have less people working, that means that you're having less people being paid. If you have less people being paid, that means that you have less people having money to buy things. If you have less people buying things, then you reduce more your production. If you reduce more your production, then you have to fire more workers. Then the unemployment rises way more, and in that way the unemployment rises more, and there is less people to consume your product. If there is less people consuming your products, then you produce even less, you fire more people, unemployment continue rising, you have less people buying your stuff, you continue reducing their population, the prices go, all the prices go low, all the markets go low, everything gets super cheap, but because there is no one having the money to buy anything. So basically, this is what we call deflation. Deflation is the opposite of inflation. In inflation, all the prices go up because apparently there is a lot of people having a lot of money to buy things. In deflation, there is no people buying things, so the prices drop down. However, since prices drop down, production is reduced, so because the enterprises cannot have the income they had before, and everything goes down, 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 down. And the problem is that yes, this event occurred in the United States. However, remember that during the 1920s, basically the reconstruction of Europe was relying basically on the American economy. So suddenly when the American economy collapsed, then also the reconstruction processes of Europe collapsed. And with the reconstruction process of Europe collapsing, then the European markets also fell. France fell, Great Britain, Italy, Germany, and suddenly all the economies, including ours, Mexico, all the economies that depended on the United States, since the American economy had collapsed, well, they collapsed with them. There was only one country that remained, that was Japan, that it was also pretty affected by the United States collapse. Why? Because remember that the Japanese have almost no space for producing food. So the only way they had to produce food was through the free market. However, what happens if there is no one there to sell you stuff? Well, you'll find a way to feed your people. And remember that the Japanese population was constantly growing. So this also affected Japan. And well, because of that, the United States summed in one of the worst crises its history had seen, that as I called you, is the Great Depression. And now the American government had to face a new issue. That was, okay, how are we getting out of this situation? And it was not only the United States. Little by little, other economies that were also affected by this collapse of the world economies decided to find other strategies in order to save their economies. Okay, basically all the markets got frozen at that moment. So basically what happened? Well, many countries started taking different decisions in order to confront this economic crisis. And well, we will see that in later on classes. Some of these solutions actually led to the rise of fascism in Europe. But that we'll see it later on. Now let's focus on the United States. The United States in the 1930s chose an option that today we know as New Deal. New Deal is based in an economic theory called, and this is a difficult word, Keynesianism, because it was a philosophy, an economic model proposed by the economist John Maynard Keynes. Okay, Keynesianism. And well, basically, what's Keynesianism? Keynesianism is the idea of the government spending to reactivate and protect the economy. So suddenly the government started giving money to different enterprises, started promoting labor unions, started creating a lot of organizations and a lot of public works, so the government would start spending, and with that spending, eventually the economy would be recreated. So suddenly the government would say, okay, I will build large-scale roads, so I will hire a lot of people to build those roads. In that way, I give money to the people, and the people will have money to consume, then they will start buying stuff. When they start buying stuff, production will start increasing. When production increases, factories will start hiring more workers, etc. And so the government started spending a lot in order to recover the economy from the Great Depression. And this movement of the New Deal was led by the Democrat president Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Okay? And well, this New Deal took place merely from 1936 till 1939. Now, the issue is that apparently the New Deal didn't have a lot of time in order to work because you know already what happened in 1940. The Second World War started. So during these 3 years, the government started spending. However, a lot of people, mainly Republicans, started questioning how good were these all this government involvement in the economy in long term. Why? Basically because, as I've already told you, money doesn't come out of magic. Okay, if the government decides to print new money, they have to back up the value of that money with something that exists. And if that doesn't exist, that leads us to inflation, meaning that the value of our money will go down. So some people say that eventually that would have led to inflation. In addition, remember that government works with our taxes. So without a lot of people paying taxes, how long would the New Deal have survived? Actually, many people consider that actually the New Deal was a strategy of the Democratic Party to show a new face to the American population. The Democratic Party was was seen as something very negative because in the Civil War they were in favor of slavery and they were only basically backed by white and rich people. With the New Deal, suddenly African Americans, the few Latin Americans that already lived it, Puerto Ricans, and lower class Americans started feeling attracted with the New Deal. And in that way, the Democrats started calling those people that were in favor of the New Deal as New Deal liberals, in contrast with the classical liberals. Okay? So what's the difference with New Deal liberalism and classical liberalism? Okay? Sorry. Well, classical liberalism states that the government shouldn't exist, that the government should disappear, while New Deal liberalism states that no, that actually the government should always be helping the economy in order for it to recover. So what happens? When we hear people as Hillary Clinton, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, saying that they are liberals, basically they are saying that they are New Deal liberals, referring to the fact that they prefer the the government controlling the economy rather than having a free market economy. Okay, so classical liberals believe in free market economy. They believe that the government shouldn't exist, that the government can be replaced by markets, etc. While the New Deal liberals believe that no, that actually the government is the one that should help the economy to reestablish. And why is this idea of the New Deal quite controversial? Well, because up to nowadays, historians have not coincided regarding the extent in which the New Deal basically and really helped the Americans overcome the Great Depression. Basically because it lasted too short and it was interrupted by another event that some people consider that was the real reason why the American economy activated. And that was the same Second World War. When we are in war, we enter to a very similar economic philosophy called Keynesianism Keynesianism of war. That basically is the idea that the government is spending, but it is spending in war. The idea is that when the governments start investing a lot of money in tanks, in missiles, in soldiers, in uniforms, in boots, in bullets, in ammunition, in bombs, grenades, etc., fire throwers, and all the things that you need to defend yourself or to attack the other when you're facing a war. That means a lot of spending from the government that eventually reactivates the economy. Why the economy is eventually reactivated with war? Well, because suddenly all private enterprises realize that if they lose war, they will lose everything against the enemy. So by themselves, they also start investing in all this warfare. And basically, though all that warfare is not produced to be sold and purchased in the United States, but to be destroyed in another country. And remember that since World War, it's a total war. That means that you have to do whatever you need to do in order to destroy your enemy, or your enemy will destroy you back. Then that means that all the companies are willing to produce a lot of things that will be destroyed. And that all the people will start investing at least the 2 cents they have in order to protect their country from war. So take into account that the New Deal ideals of the government spending in order to reactivate the economy after the Great Depression took place from 1936 to 1939. However, in 1939, when the Second World War started, suddenly a lot of the economies started reactivating because of the production of war. This idea again by this idea that the government should spend in war in order to reactivate the economy. And actually that's the idea basically that the main initiators of the World War II, Hitler and Mussolini, had in mind. Mainly Hitler. Mainly Hitler's idea was based on Nationalism of War. Basically Hitler said, okay, Germany is suffering also from a Great Depression. However, if we start investing in war, eventually we will bring back our economy. Okay, so hopefully you have understood these topics. Later on I'm recording the equivalent version and in Spanish for those that are having a little more problems with it. And well, thank you very much, and answer the questionnaire that I put you in Google Classroom. Remember that the activities that I upload in Google Classroom are supposed to be done the day they are in the they have as due date. They have as due date, but at 23:59. The idea is that you do these activities at the time that we will have normal classes. Thank you very much.